This week's episode of Taking Inventory is brought to you by one of our sponsors, Meet Market, your AI assistant for e-commerce marketing. Market isn't just another growth tool, it's a member of your team, helping you keep a pulse on your business and trained to save you time and make you money. It's also co-founded by James Barrow and myself. Visit us at withmarket.com. Now, let's get to the podcast. Steven Rosenblatt is a co-founder and general partner at Oceans Ventures, which recently closed its second fund focused on AI, big data, and the future of work. Prior to starting Oceans, Steven was the president of Foursquare, where he transformed the company from a consumer-facing to an enterprise business, and in the process grew revenue by more than 70 times. Before that, he was at Apple, where he launched iAd, which is Apple's advertising platform for brands and developers. So really excited to welcome Steven to the podcast today. Welcome.
It's great to be here.
Thank you, man, for making the time. I think maybe a good place to start is what you're working on now. We want to get into all the stuff you've done in the past as well, but I've been a huge fan of, kind of most, I think probably everything you've done, but in particular, what you're doing at Oceans Ventures, I think is just really special and pretty unique. So we'd love to hear kind of about like what inspired you to start it. You guys have a different approach than other funds, and just kind of think we have a bunch of entrepreneurs listening to this too. So just kind of like, can you give them the kind of just like the whole spiel about what you're doing over there?
Yeah, I mean, listen, it started back in 1999 when I started my first startup in New York City. When there really was no tech, there were no engineers in New York, but I was building and involved in a very early internet company. And being in New York in tech here, we were all a very tiny community. You knew everyone. And as I kind of grew my career, first 7 to 10 years was digital media internet. But then the engineers started to come, and I helped build a company in 2008 called Quattro Wireless. And Quattro Wireless was at the forefront of really helping developers monetize their apps and their WAP sites and websites at the time through ads, and we launched one of the first SDKs. And that for me was one of my first, that was my first venture backed moment. We were backed by Highland Capital, legendary investor Bob Davis, Globespan, a guy named Andy Goldfarb. And that for me, I was 27 years old, and I was sitting in the boardroom with these amazing investors during the great financial crisis. And it was eye-opening for me. I learned a ton. I got to really form my own point of view on what I thought, VC should do. And then we sold the company to Apple. And when during that time, being in New York, again, a very small community, not many real exits. And I would get hit up all the time by friends and founders to help mentor them, including things like Techstars when David Tisch was running it. And so what I started to realize, and I started to ask founders just in conversation, what are the things they need the most help on, and why have they not gone to their VC, their investor, for that help? And I kept hearing the same answer. And this was from like really seasoned entrepreneurs too. Most of them were like, listen, I don't trust my investor has never built a company before. They don't know what I'm going through. They've never seen it before. The second thing was always around, like, 3 core themes would always pop up. I would always get questions. How did you hire this person? How should I think about hiring? Culture, things like that. The second theme was always like, how did you turn this like mobile company in 2008 when no one ever thought of doing anything on mobile into a revenue business, right? And then when I went to Foursquare in 2012, started as an advisor, it got the same question. How'd you turn this consumer app into an enterprise data company? And how'd you start generating revenue? So this idea of the second kind of lane was about going to market, figuring out how to go to market to find product market fit. And then the third questions I always get was around fundraising and financing, over and over for the last, many years. And those same conversations with founders, just kind of the same thing kept happening, even with the amount of money that was going in the last decade. I'd ask founders, go to your investor about this. I don't really trust them, or I don't think they really know, I don't think they really give me the best advice. So I finally, after, I had kind of set out on a journey in 2012 when I left Apple before Foursquare. I was going to start this kind of concept of Oceans. And I just was going around New York City talking to everyone who'd started accelerators, studios, you name it. And I realized that what New York was missing were really like true passionate operator led VCs that understood what it took to build a company from the very earliest stage, kind of that 0-1, and scale it through IPO. And finally, in 2018, after 6 years at Foursquare, and I'm sure we'll get into some of this stuff, but I just said enough is enough. Like, the world didn't need another venture fund, but I just could not talk to another entrepreneur who was like, I'm frustrated with my investor. My investor doesn't return my phone call, or, they really aren't that helpful, or they wrote a check and disappeared, and, and then they call me like a year later because they want to get into the next round. And I'm like, that just doesn't make sense to me, right? The earliest formation stage of a company is the most difficult. Founders are putting their blood, sweat, and tears. They're sacrificing so much personally in their lives. They deserve more. And that was what Josh, Ron, and I, who started talking about this in 2016, really aligned on, that we need to do something different.
Yeah, it's pretty awesome. And I know from some of your current portfolio company founders have told me that what you're saying is the truth, which is awesome too. It's not bullshit, and that it actually has been like a different experience. And so I think for just anyone out there that is thinking about starting companies, they're telling the truth. So hit them up. But
Well, I think, James, to that point, like, I think it comes down to, right, how did we architect Oceans, right? We were very deliberate. We are weird, right? I think when you see seed firms form, they're usually like one or two people, and it's very cookie cutter. And we were 5 people, and we intentionally, Josh, Ron, who had opened Facebook New York in 2007, someone who was my friend, I met in 23 years ago in the early New York tech ecosystem, admired in terms of how he really took products to market. He was one of the world-class talent, hired so many amazing people. And he and I said, listen, again, let's go. We agreed on those 3 lanes. Talent, we brought in, we harassed Glenn Handler, who was Sheryl Sandberg's first recruiter at Facebook, and built out the business org, and he came on board. I had met Sarah Barrick, who's now another partner who had 20 years operations experience at number of SaaS and NLP companies. And we brought Brian Liu in, who had, again, 18 years or so, buying startups in corp dev M&A at scale, and kind of had that empathy, and was an engineer early in his career. So we were deliberate in the team, and we were deliberate how we came to market. Our first fund was intentionally small, because we did not want, the reason we won deals is because we wrote a big check. We wanted we wanted the opposite. Let's force founders to really want us. Let's really win deals because of the value prop and the value, and then prove out that thesis is right. Not because of the big data. Founders didn't need our money, but they took our money, squeezed us into rounds because of that. And so, like any startup, I think you got to force yourself, almost be subscale, do the really hard stuff, prove it out, find your customers that really like show passion, and then scale it. And that was kind of the exact same kind of approach we took and have taken in building Oceans.
And it looks like that, that thesis has panned out exactly how kind of you planned it. I mean, you guys have raised now this second fund. I'm curious, what was the idea around the verticals that you would focus on, both for the first fund, but now with AI, big data, future of work for this second fund? How did you guys land on those being the kind of areas of interest for you?
Yeah, so we start always with people. Like, I think that's what makes us, it's really hard for a quant from Wall Street to come in and do seed, because they don't understand what it takes to build a company. And they don't understand the genetic makeup of a founder that makes great founders. And we were very lucky. I sat next to, for 6 years, people like Dennis Crowley, who founded Foursquare, Andy Miller, who founded Quattro, and Ishwar Predarthan. These are amazing people. Lars Albright, right? We knew the founder pedigree. Josh saw Facebook. He was interviewed by Zuck in the early days. So we just had a really good knack of like what talent. And I think when we're betting early, the first layer we look at is the founder pedigree and profile, right? And very specific things about their DNA, their personality, the way they're starting it, why they're starting it, and do we think they could build the best teams in the world? Because that's ultimately, like, generational companies are built when you attract the best talent. So that's first and foremost. Then in terms of the themes, we're unapologetically generalists. I just don't fundamentally believe that seed stage funds should be overly verticalized. I think it's just really hard. Trends change. I mean, look at crypto, right? Most of those funds now are somehow AI funds, right? Or chasing the next thing. And the reality is that if you're an early stage investor, you have to understand talent and thematics change. So how did we land on what we're doing today? We're mostly, again, people, and then like this AI plus big data meets future work, because we fundamentally believe the last couple of years has changed the way we will work and live forever, right? And it doesn't mean, this isn't about whether people go into an office or not. It just means that we took this monumental leap forward in how technology is transforming everything about the way we work, and obviously AI is going to be a catalyst to that as well. So that's our theme today. Fund one, we did a little bit more of a number of different thematics, and so I think the best seed investors are looking 10 to 15 years out. They're really in tune with what's bubbling up from the bottom, from the talent, right? That's coming to them, seeing things, and then making bets accordingly. And that's what we really try to do.
Yeah, the idea of being like an unapologetic generalist, I think, is really compelling. I have a friend, David Lee, who was at SV Angel, who I've talked to about this stuff a lot, and he was like, "Of course, that's what you're going to do early, like pre-seed and seed. Like you have to do that." And like he said a line that stuck with me. He said this probably like a year ago, was that there's like a mountain of tech innovation coming. It's so clear, like you can see the mountain, and it's like for you to predict how that is going to be used and all the resources from that mountain are going to be like put to work is like crazy. You just can't predict it, and so you just have to go get really good people. And it feels like, to some extent, that's kind of how you guys are approaching it. One thing with that, and this is just my own sort of curiosity, given you guys have like such a good network and access to talent, have you guys thought about moving into like the incubation phase sort of studio model, or do you have a point of view?
Yeah, I'm gonna come back to that in 1 second. So first of all, David Lee's great. I think he's an incredible investor. The second thing I would say is I do think there's a lot of LPs that are making a huge mistake investing early and investing, overly vertical to check a box, because they like have to get into a climate, or they have to get into, they want just AI. I think it's a really big mistake, and I think they're going to see that a couple of years from now to say, why did we only invest vertically? And I think some of the crypto only ones are doing that. So it's funny you asked that question, James, because like when I started down this path after I left Apple in 2012, the thinking was I wanted to take the best of the studio model, the best of the accelerator model, bring that together to build the best venture firm. For me, we've thought a lot about kind of incubating companies, and we always come back to the one thing that kind of stops us from doing it, which is we still believe that the best generational companies are built by the founders who are sitting on that idea that's like so deep in their core that they have to build it, that we struggle with, I think, the right formula to build and incubate a company. We just, and then the accelerator model, again, what we always loved, and I've learned this from the early days of the Techstars, is we loved the kind of hands-on approach, but I would mentor founders for coming out of these accelerators and meet them early on, and they would say a similar thing, which is like, listen, they did such a great job prepping me to fundraise, but now I got to go build a company, like, and now they disappear, they're gone, right? Like I'm out of I'm in, on my own now. And so that intense help is awesome. But then once we graduate, it's kind of like, I wish there were people around me. And so those are some of the like DNA roots that we took to kind of form Oceans, which is a little bit of each, like a little bit of that hands-on, a little bit of that approach, but like we're not going to disappear, ever. Now, our goal is to get companies to a Series A, but we still get founders who've raised Series A's and onto, kind of deep on their way to Series B's, who have great investors on the cap table, say, call us and say, Steven, can I talk to you about this like one thing that's like really on my mind that I really don't want to talk to my board member about? Or I just trust you. Like, I know you guys are going to give us like straight, honest feedback, and like you've been through it. We get a lot of those kind of calls, even though we spend less time with those founders. So I think that's, and we do have this every couple months. We go through this, like, should we, incubate? But to date, we haven't done it.
It sounds like you guys had a great experience in 2008 with your investor base, and then there was years of kind of the VC model changing and the interplay and the dynamics between founders and their investors. And so, why is it, do you think, that a lot of founders either don't trust their investors or don't trust them enough to have those honest conversations, or they don't feel like they can have those honest conversations in a way that's safe space? Why do you think that's kind of coming out?
Because I think there's a couple of things. One, a lot of investors that are out there have never actually been involved building a company through good times and bad times, right? Like a lot of even a lot of the investors the last couple of years, they only know up and to the right in bull markets. They've never been through downturns, right? So they don't understand. So that's number one. Number two is they haven't been through themselves. Like, 2008, we could have been out of business at Quattro just as much as we sold to Apple for, a great outcome. And so we've been through these near-death experiences collectively. We've been through down rounds. I had to recap Foursquare. Like, these are things you kind of, it's like an athlete. Like, typically, like, some of the best coaches in sports are those that have been athletes, right? They've been players, right? They command the respect from the locker room. It doesn't mean that every once in a while you get an amazing professional coach who didn't grow up that way, who wasn't a player, but the vast majority played. They were on the field. They know what it takes. And so I think we hear this every single pitch when we get off the phone, the first conversation with a founder. They're like, this is so refreshing. It's so different. You're asking me like hard questions, but but you really understand what it takes to build a business. And I think in general, there's a couple of things. One, take like the multi-stage funds that are doing seed. I'm not saying some of them won't be helpful when asked, but that couple $1 million check early on is completely immaterial to their out. They got to return billions. So they're literally just writing a check, and we all know it's an option check to one day hopefully be on the cap table to lead a down round, a bigger round downstage, downstream. And so I just think like stage specific is important, right? Like large firms aren't going to spend time on early companies, right? I think operational founders know who's really built and who hasn't, because you have the stories to connect with founders. You have real examples that you can talk about. And so credibility is there. And I just think some investors, frankly, just don't care. Like literally, we hear like they don't return. I hear this all the time. Like my investor won't even return an email. That's shocking to me. That person should not be investing in venture in tech. They should be written off, disappear, bye-bye. I mean, it's crazy. And it happens all the time.
Yeah.
So I don't know. So the bar is really low. We don't try to just jump the bar. We try and again answer. And if we don't know something, we help them with someone who does. So yeah, I think it just comes down to, I'd say here's one other thing. Investors are really don't know how to have hard conversations with founders. Like we do. Why? Because we have credibility. We see something, we say something. We see something. Doesn't mean we're right, but we try and provoke a discussion and a conversation. It shocks me. There's so many investors that don't know how to tackle the hard stuff with founders. They wait too long. By the time too long, then it becomes adversarial, and like then it's really bad. Then you have like, there's anger.
Yeah.
If you tackle things early and address it, you won't get to that situation. And if you do, at least you made a good effort.
A quick break from one of our sponsors. Meet Market, your AI assistant for e-commerce marketing. Market isn't just another growth tool. It's a member of your team, helping you keep a pulse on your business and trained to save you time and make you money. It's also co-founded by James Barrow and myself. Visit us at withmarket.com. Now back to the podcast.
Yeah. I'm curious from just based on your experiences, like given that, I mean, you have obviously like a ton of victories, but you have like battle scars from getting there, right? Like recapping Foursquare probably was like not super fun, like as a process, and obviously global financial crisis. Like, do you find with founders, are the battle wounds? Do you have to like sometimes be like, okay, like, am I like projecting my like what was crazy in these moments, or is it like, have you found a good way to like? Because I find that running a company for a second time that like I keep trying to draw parallels back to the first one. And sometimes I'd be like, this says like they are not analogous, and like don't do this, James. So I don't know if you've like had that sort of gymnastics kind of go on in your head.
Definitely have that gymnastics go on in my head. But I also like there's just certain fundamental things, right? Like first time founders are scared to admit vulnerabilities. They're scared to admit, they think here's what I see. First time founders, very hard to get them to admit that like what they're not good at or weak spots. They're very much enamored with the brand name venture fund. Uh, they are very much enamored with optics around raising a big round and care more about the number and how much. The second to fourth time founders, I'm seeing like we're doing an investment right now, and I love the conversation I have with this founder because he's like, I never want to over fundraise again because I've done that before. And could I raise more money? Absolutely. Could I raise at a higher valuation? Absolutely. But I care way more about who's on the cap table and setting things up properly than I do optics around it. So you see a big difference. The second and fourth time founders, like I suck at hiring salespeople. I make the pain go away. Like I'm not good at it. I screw up every time. Right. Or like every time I try to hire an engineer, a great engineer, I mess this one up. And so they're more free because they've done it before and that they're more vulnerable about it. So yeah, I mean, I think it's more like they're just fundamental things. And we were probably one of the very few firms giving information against our own personal interests. We were the ones we'd get a founder call. They'd say, you know what? I got this term sheet. It's crazy. It's 100x revenue. I'm nervous about it. I'm like, you should be nervous about it. Because guess what? You're probably not going to grow into that.
Yeah.
And this, and they were like, I know. And how should we handle it? And so, yeah, it benefited us, but we would tell them like, you got to think long-term. These are sequences and stages. So I would say, James, like, yeah, I try and like, listen, there's certain business things where I'm like, I try and, I think go through that mental gymnastics, but they're just core fundamental things that are tried and true over good and bad markets that I just think you can't screw up, right? And fundraising and sequencing and how you do it and how you raise so you don't have to do bad down rounds or you don't have to recap or you don't like those are the things that I think are like that goes, that motion, for example, is something that works in all markets, in my opinion.
One of the other common questions you said you get a lot from founders is how did you transform Foursquare from a consumer facing platform to an enterprise business? And as a early consumer of Foursquare, always loved the platform, and then going to Snap, we used it as an enterprise client, and we led some deals with the teams over there, and it was a whole new point of view on what Foursquare was doing and the power of the data and just geo data in general. And so, how did you transform this business from totally consumer to this enterprise powerhouse that it is today?
Yeah, it was pretty kind of it was really fascinating. And it really started with I came on as an advisor because I wanted to build Oceans in 2012. And so I wasn't looking for a full-time job. I came in there and I never forget, like really like the first day or week, I come in and Dennis, the founder of Foursquare CEO, was like, Steven, come sit in our exec meeting. I had just worked at Apple. Okay, Apple's the most secretive company in the world. I sit next to people. No one knew what each other was working on because no one talked to each other about anything because it was so secretive. And day one, Dennis is like, I'm going to open up. You need to listen to the exec meeting. And they started opening up a lot of the data. And their initial, when I came in 2012, they just raised this 75 million super high profile round from Andreessen. It was Andreessen's first, Andreessen Horowitz' first high profile round in New York. And so we were already about 100 million or so in. Union Square Ventures was an investor. And we were going down the path of building like a Yelp model. And I just started asking questions, looking at the data, looking at the consumer growth. And I just was like, guys, we're going to make like $100 with like literally, I'm like, we raised $100 million. We have to build like $1 billion. Our VCs want 10x on that. We can't think about doing like anything that's going to be single millions in revenue. We need to think about what's 100 millions in revenue. And we don't have enough traffic and engagement and growth on the consumer side in markets that we can monetize to build that. But I said, listen, I just spent 2 years launching iAd for Apple. I spoke to CMOs, CEOs, and everyone wanted access to location data. That was obviously the kind of, what made mobile unique. And we couldn't really do it for privacy reasons. And I said, you guys are sitting on some really valuable data. You've got millions of users that essentially created a panel who check in and tell you where they are. Fortunately, we had the engineering prowess where we had an API and developer ecosystem that was really robust. We had built technology that allowed us to understand whether people were on the first floor of a building or 10th floor of a building, and took all the footprint of that. So we had this really powerful tech stack. We had this really powerful panel, and we had this really interesting developer ecosystem. And I said, if we just try and monetize the app, we're going to cap out at like single millions, revenue, unless we believe we can grow again. And we hadn't. We spent a lot of money trying to grow. And so that was really the obvious pivot to me was we need to take our data and we need to build products around that. And so we then built an ad targeting product, which grew like exponentially. We built a developer product because you said Snap, Uber. We were really the Intel Inside for the developer ecosystem using location. And then we built kind of an attribution and measurement product around that. So that was all kind of like, how do we build things that can really build scalable revenue? But it was hard. I mean, listen, there was a lot of headwind with privacy. There's a lot of headwind with location data. I always felt and was hoping that one of the bigger platforms would buy us, and that with their distribution and our technology, we would build, that would be really powerful. But there were a million reasons why that never happened. And but I was really proud of the fact that we were able to get, when I left 6 years later, we had, we were about 100 million revenue business, and down to like losing, a single $1 million, not the 35 million and no revenue when I came in there.
Well, it's also funny that like that playbook is now basically the retail media playbook. I mean, you hear just like everything right now is basically like subscale publisher using their data for attribution, targeting, and intelligence outside of their walls. It's like basically what you guys kind of, I think, normalized in a way. And I feel like in some ways, and even until you've said it, and we've done a bunch of these podcasts like with people from some of these RMNs, like I don't even know if you guys get enough credit for kind of like being like, no, this is like a viable way to actually do this if you are not a Facebook or Snapchat style publisher. So it's pretty cool. And I assume, again, it's one of those things where, if I were sitting on a business right now that like had done like well, but it wasn't going to work in its current form, and I had to figure out how the hell do I move things around to create a better outcome, like having you on the other side of the table would be pretty useful. So it's a pretty cool experience. You mentioned the Apple experience, just like, are you even allowed to say, like, what is that place like?
I left there now 13 years ago, but it was fascinating, right? So Google buys our competitor AdMob. So Apple tried to buy AdMob at the time. Famously, Google comes in, outbids Apple. Apple does very few acquisitions. This is still under Steve Jobs. Wasn't going to overbid. Google buys AdMob. Apple wants a company because they knew that the key to selling more iPhones was the developer ecosystem. And they knew that developers monetize in two ways, really ads and subscription, especially like back then and still pretty much to this day. And they were Steve Jobs was paranoid that Google was going to basically rip its ad infrastructure out of the iOS ecosystem and just focus on Android, and then the developers would follow. So we needed to build something and own something that we could own at Apple that was not necessarily contingent on Google. The other thing was he also wanted ads at the time that were representative of the beautiful phones and as he said, wanted TV-like experiences. So we sell it, we get bought, we literally I had a like Apple's security team comes into our office in New York. We were on Broadway and like Houston. They come into our office. They're like, "You guys can't stay here. This does not meet our security needs." I started working with Apple Real Estate, find space, moved, kind of ultimately landed on 105th, which is where the Apple office had opened. And at the same time, again, we didn't know what the heck they were going to do with us, but a few of us were basically sequestered under secrecy that Apple was going to shut down the Quattro platform, use the tech, and launch this new business. Again, I had no idea what it was. All we were told was we need to. This was like January of 2010. They wanted to announce. Steve wanted to announce this as one of his tent poles at WWDC in June, and that we had like 3 weeks or less to tell them what we needed to build into the iOS because code freeze was happening, and once that happens, everything's locked. So, like in a matter of 2 to 3 weeks, and oh, by the way, we want to announce to the world that we're making developers all this money. So, my first few weeks were like a few of us knew about it. I was managing this Quattro team. I was trying to like this new thing we were going to launch. I was sitting with like the good news is Steve Jobs was like my boss. Andy Miller, the founder of Quattro, was who I reported to Steve. And he was having meetings every week with Steve, and we had access to like the best of the best because we were launching this. So put marketing deck together, and I literally going on a road show. There were like 3 to 5 of us. It was me, Andy, Mike Owen, a couple of us who went on a road show to go pitch this thing. It was a deck. There was no product. It wasn't even launched. And the only thing I remember all this very clearly, was Steve wanted $1 million deals in mobile in 2010. I was like, $1 million deals? No one do. Facebook's not doing $1 million deals. This is crazy, right? So we go out, we start pitching agencies. We walk in, they're like, "Get the hell out!" Like, we're not doing $1 million deals on this. Anyway, we get our first commit. I never forget this. We get our first commit. Andy tells Steve, "Awesome, we got our first brand. They're launching with us, $1 million." And Steve goes to Andy and goes, "I never said $1 million. We're not doing $1 million deals. We're doing 10 million. We're not taking anything less than 10 million." He calls me up. He's like, "Steven, I got good news and bad news. Good news is Steve was happy we got, basically we got brand. Bad news is he's not taking $1 million deals. It needs to be a $10 million deal." $10 million deals in mobile in 2010 was just completely not existent. Anyway, fast forward in 6 weeks, we get 4 $10 million deals. We sell $60 million of ads. I get invited, Andy and I, and I think it was Ishwar too, maybe, and our head of engineering, Jay, like we get invited to WWDC, like second row, and they announced iAd, and we were like one of the 10 tent poles. So it was crazy, the most intense time, stressful time of my entire business career. And I've done a lot of startups. That was the most crazy intense time. And oh, by the way, the day before the keynote, when Steve was supposed to show Unilever, I got a call that he's going to cut Unilever. I had to call the Unilever folks and tell them that, who were flying out, that they're actually not going to show Unilever. And and Steve didn't care. He's like, if they want their $10 million back, they can take it. Oh my God. It was great. And many more. Like it was nuts.
That's
and
wild.
obviously is an amazing company. It's incredibly secretive. I spent 2 years there. It was amazing learnings. I think the thing I really also learned is just how much focus they have in building a great product. And that stuck with me.
Yeah. It's interesting to think too, that it's just like, everyone, I think now people are pretty aware, like Apple's going to build a massive ads business. It's just like a moment in time. And, we have friends who we don't know what they do there, but we know what they used to do at that place like Snapchat. We assume they're probably doing similar things. But it's cool to think that like your guys' company will always be like a little part of that, like it will end up being this. I mean, I can't imagine how big that ads business will be one day.
Yeah, it's kind of like on one end, and I try not to think about this, but I'm like, we were way ahead of Amazon. Like Amazon didn't have an ad real business then, and I think it could have been today a $50 billion business, and it's really now, up until more recently, it's a search ads business. I don't know what, and I think selling ads in, Apple TV and so forth, or whatever they're doing. But it became more of a display business. And I think a lot of that had to do with Steve when he passed, that losing some of that vision of like, let's reinvent the format and the pricing and build this. I don't know what it would have become. And I do agree with you. I think it will, it's obvious, and it can be a massive business because of the scale. But I am bummed out that we didn't get a chance early on to build that business, because it could have been that business.
Yeah, totally. It's that story too just gives me like in a much different scale, but like just like reminds me of like these early Snap days where like it's amazing in these big companies when you have like a leader like in this case, Steven, like I don't, Evan Spiegel isn't Steve Jobs, but like the focus on like sort of the impossible, and then it happens and you're like, oh, you can close these deals. It's like, sorry, shouldn't have said that was impossible. But it's amazing, like even for founders now, like I wonder, like Daniel and me had an internal call this morning where it's like we probably don't even hold ourselves like to a high enough bar. Like we get so much done, and it's an interesting perspective again, I think, just like for founders, and like something that like you hear that story, you're like, okay, can kind of do anything.
Yeah. It's such a generational person that's got this like true reality distortion field where they're just going to power through anything and think about the impossible and will it to happen or not. I mean, listen, 9 out of 10 of those type of founders, I think, are either, become Netflix specials or kind of, they just disappear because they just like destroy, it's scorch earth through going through it.
Yeah.
But when you have that, founder that's got that magical power and they're able to do it, it is like an Evan, obviously Steve, it is pretty amazing to be part of, and or Zuck to see that, which my partners have as well.
Yeah. And I mean, hearing you tell that story too I was just laughing because, trying to secure the $1 million deal and then the $10 million deal. And then you fast forward, and obviously we have the years that we can look at now as fact, but so many businesses were built in that app store. Public companies, billion-dollar companies, companies that were spending $10,000 in an hour, you know? And so you being able to see it from the ground floor, and then obviously as things kind of continue to develop, but as you look back, like, are there things that you see in the mobile space as it evolved and as it continues to evolve that you look and you're like, that was a tipping point, or today, like, this is the direction that potentially we're going to see in 5-10 years time?
Yeah, it's a great, I think the thing that I think a lot about is sometimes things are 5 to 10 years ahead of its time and you need new platform and technology to do it, right? Like Instacart is really like Urban Fetch or Cosmo for those of us who remember that, right? And like the idea of, or DoorDash, like there was Cosmo and Urban Fetch. They did pioneer last minute delivery, but they failed because distribution didn't make sense because we didn't have that then, right? And then they became successful. And I do try and think about what were companies last 5-10 years that were just ahead of its time, like great idea, right? But I mean, look at like there's like Second Life that like still too early. I mean, we were that the metaverse may or may not become, but like these things have a way of happening 5 to 10 years later when technology is there. So I do think about what are businesses or companies where they just were early years ago that now with AI and generative AI and these new technology shifts that just may be right now that maybe failed previously. Or we're going to see what happens with spatial computing, right? We've talked about VR and AR for years, and it's never really hasn't transpired. Is now the time? Is Vision OS and what it will lead to going to be the time where spatial computing takes a leap forward and things that were built years ago? So I do think ideas tend to kind of regenerate and then succeed because technology, these massive technology advancements happen. And so those are the type of things I try and like I try to kind of get my head around. And brainstorm around and talk about to figure out, okay, what could that look like now, that may have failed previously.
And it's funny. I wonder if there'll be a fund that like a thesis of just like taking these old ideas and trying to and to invest in. But you mentioned like the Vision OS 7 again. Like I just I always go back to like our kind of Snap experience a lot, where like Spectacles like was right, but it was wrong. Like, and then Meta just announced their new glasses, and everyone seems to think they're just like awesome. Um, do you think you guys will? Are you at the point where you're like, okay, like when it comes to spatial computing or like these new, just sort of next frontiers? Are you at the point now where you're like, okay, Oceans is like looking for those deals, or is again, it's just like if a founder comes up and believes in it, we'll take a real look.
Yeah, I mean, I am intrigued, and I would actually love to see people who are building kind of in the spatial area. I think there is a timing, right? We still don't know. Distribution is still going to be really low for the next couple of years. So I don't know if it's now or if it's 5 years from now, but if that magic combination of insanely pedigreed founder with a really incredible vision and some unique insight comes to us, and with some type of like early spatial idea that feels like it's the right application for, early on, it's the right use case, it's the right use of the platform. I'd love to find, like, those are things that definitely intrigue me, maybe more than my partners, but I'm very intellectually curious about, because I do think it's not it's a matter of time. It's not an if, it's a when. And I don't know if it's now, if it's 3 years from now, or if it's 5 years from now, but I do believe we're going to see that. And then that intersection with AI in the spatial realm, I think, is going to create some really crazy experiences.
Yeah, and before we get into Daniel's kind of world famous rapid fire, last question, just you mentioned sort of the process. I think for founders, like how does the decision making process work for you guys? Like if you're super excited about spatial and Josh is like, man, you're crazy. Like what is that process like at a fund made up of friends, but also like, they're investing other people's money?
Oh, we debate hard, like, listen, I think we have a lot of discussions, debate. We, most of the time we'll see things from different angles, which I think is part of the magic. I think for us, it's, Josh and I will, um, I think the way we kind of think of it is like, if I'm like, I have to do this, as long as Josh and the team are not like, if we do this, like, I'm not on, like, I'm done, like, I'm quitting, we will look at that, like, and probably do it seriously, right? I think, like, and by the way, the outliers happen when it's not obvious, right? And so I think what we have a unique advantage with our team is that Glenn kind of brings this talent perspective and lane and assessment on background, skills, network, etc. Sarah brings this really deep client services, product focus kind of lens, and real interesting empathetic lens. Brian brings it more from like a market analysis. So we have this advantage that I think a lot of other smaller funds don't, is we can see things through our experience, we can see things through different operating lanes, and then Josh and I will kind of go through, final debate. And listen, we've done things that I'm like, I'm not going to quit, but I don't agree with, but you clearly see something, and vice versa. And I think you kind of, that's what makes it, I think that's what you have to do, because that's where, yeah, things happen. As far as like, yeah, in our process, I mean, I beg founders, like the last 3 years of shotgun weddings were just awful, and they're going to end in horrible divorces. Like,
Mhm.
I just, like, we know that. But I tell founders this all the time. We may not be the biggest check. We may not give you the highest price. These are 10-year relationships. You're stuck. We're stuck, right? And don't go in, like, pick Oceans because you feel we're the best partner, and we're going to do the right things, and we're going to be there for the long haul. And if you pick someone else because they came in at a little higher price or giving you money over us, that's probably the wrong reason, and vice versa, right? Like, take the time, get to know each other, do it right. because these things are long, and the most successful, I think, relationships are ones that are everyone goes in knowing exactly what they're getting. And so we take the time to diligence, we take the time to get to know a founder. There's not much to diligence, obviously, because most of these companies aren't real businesses yet.
Yeah.
But we do spend a lot of time really assessing people we know around these founders. Usually we know a few people. We're 1 or 2 degrees away from people who know these founders really well. And that's the thing. That's when we tend to get really excited, and then ultimately we'll make the decision to invest.
And one thing that, as you explained that kind of resonated too, is that I have like a mentor of mine when talking about this sort of thing about like who do you work with in a business context is like, although it's hard to believe, like life is long in most cases. And as a result of that, like don't pretend these are like transactional moments, because like you will be with these people for a long time. And I feel like most founders don't get that. And that's where you get the, I'll take the higher number and all that stuff. So it's like, it definitely resonates here in that.
And then not all found, like a lot of firms operate, most firms operate in isolation, right? I have this partner, they're the only person I talk to. And so I think founders sometimes get enamored with a brand name, but it's actually not the right partner for them, or it's a newer partner, it may not be the right, and so that, like, they get that comes back to haunt them. Sometimes that partner may be inexperienced, but they happen to join a name brand firm, right? And again, I think it's knowing stage specific, right? Do you want in the pre-seed, early seed? Do you really want, like, who do you really want? And I'm a big believer in stage specific, and especially the funds that are dedicated early, that are really their DNA is to help founders early on. Because by the way, when a founder is a Series C or D company, you just want capital and you want governance, right? And then you're thinking differently. So, and you have money, you have your exec team. You're not looking for the same things early on. You have no exec team. You're limited in capital. You're limited in connectivity. And so I think, like, it is important for founders to think about that. And I think that's where a lot of mistakes are made. And I see that's where a lot of companies go out of business because of that.
Yeah. And whether you guys end up investing or not, is there some piece of advice beyond just the kind of how to evaluate potential investors, but is there a piece of advice from your operating experience and your partner's operating experiences that you tell founders and say, whether we work together or not directly, consider XYZ?
Yeah, we're, again, like, if founders ask, we're honest, right? If they don't ask, I don't always go out of my way to kind of spend the extra effort unless I know them personally. But we try to be honest with founders, like, and sometimes it's like it's just not a fit for us, and sometimes it's just like, here's why we don't see it, and these are the missing ingredients that we see.
Yeah.
It's funny, we get a lot of founders who send us deal flow who we say no to, and they're like, I wish you invested, but I really loved your approach, and here's a friend of mine who's raising, and, like, we get a lot of that, and that's also, I think, a testament to approach. But I would say, what we try to say is just, again, think long term, and think complementary. What complements you great? Who are complementary investors on the cap table that are going to add different dimensions, especially early on? I think that's really important, right? And don't party rounds, I think, don't make a whole lot of sense, right? Like, be very deliberate, and maybe sometimes you have to, and that's okay, because you need to corral capital, and sometimes you got to do what you got to do. But don't do it if you have, do it because you're doing it. I think, again, optimize for people that really are complementary, that complement you, and I think are going to be good long-term partners, and won't disappear on you. That's what we try and tell people.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's some great advice, especially given the last few years and maybe some bad habits have developed.
Don't over fundraise too early. Don't raise too much capital at too high a valuation too early. You will kill yourself, because early investors, including Series A, don't want to deal with. They don't know how to do flat rounds, down rounds. Like, it's just not in their DNA. They'd rather find something that's got momentum. So I tell founders this all the time too. You're never going to look back and be like, I can't believe I took an extra 3% dilution early on at the end if you're successful. The only thing that matters is exit, and that you exit cleanly, and that you own more of your company at the end. The things at the beginning don't matter as much. right? What matters a lot is if you put your so much blood, sweat, and tears into building something and you lose your company early because you screwed up how you fundraise. When you're successful at the end, you're never going to be like, I can't believe I don't have an extra 50 million in the bank because or 20 million or 10 million. You're going to be like, I sold or exited this company or took it public, and I did it the right way. And I will never regret taking a little extra dilution because something happened early on. And I try and tell founders, I do really believe in that.
Yeah, I have a friend who runs a big company that's doing really well, and he had a ton of fights early on with investors about taking on too much dilution, and then I remember he told me like a year ago now that it's like killing it, and he's like, I didn't realize I could always get more equity. He's like, I get new grants all the time. He's like, what was I thinking? I was like, I didn't think about that either. Sorry, man.
Totally.
Yeah. I think anyone that's listened to this episode should probably listen to the last 2 minutes again. Just I think that's the key to this. But anyone wanting to learn more, Steven, where can they find you or Oceans Ventures?
Yeah, I mean, listen, go to our website, oceans.ventures. There's a place if you're, if you're starting a company, there's a form you can fill out, and go, kind of go from there. I think that's really the best way. We're here in New York. If you see us around, DM with like something specific on Twitter is, another way. You can follow me at StevenJR76. I'm on LinkedIn, although I get a million LinkedIn requests, as we all do a day. And the one thing I see all the time, I get a ping and they don't tell me, you think I'm going to respond to something that's just like a random request? Like, have some context, have a reason, tell me, bring something to light so I understand like why I should accept this. And for us, we're only investing in US companies right now. So I get a lot of reach outs from non-US founders. And it's not that I don't think they're great and want to talk to them, but we're hyper-focused ourselves in mostly US and in all US 100%. So I think that's a way to find us, but lots of different ways.
Yeah, we'll put those in the show notes, make sure people have access to that. But Steven, this is great. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's great to spend time with you and lots of fun and keep on doing great stuff.
Awesome. Thanks, man.
Before you go, we need your help. If you enjoyed this week's episode of Taking Inventory, then subscribe or rate wherever you listen to the podcast. And while you're at it, please share this episode or your favorite episode with a friend. We'll be back next week with another episode of Taking Inventory. See you then.